This is a clip of Simon Ateba being interviewed by Tucker Carlson on the Carlson Show shortly before the Tucker Carlson Show ended on Fox News. And this is Today News Africa, todaynewsafrica.com. And Simon Ateba is a correspondent for Today News Africa. In fact, he may even be the editor. And in this video, I'm going to be interviewing Simon about what is happening in Africa and getting his perspective on global and macro events.
I invested £25,000. Today, that investment is worth £5 million.
Say hello to our hero, the Hydrogen Energy Release Optimizer. Limitless power, zero emissions.
The world's most advanced cold wallet for the new generation of cryptocurrency lovers, Descent.
There is a part of the world that is increasingly important and is going to have a much bigger part to play as power shifts from the west to the east. And in this video, I'm going to be talking to a journalist who specializes in covering what's happening in this part of the world. And in particular, we're going to be talking about the collapse of US diplomacy. Hi everybody, this is Crypto Rich, working with you to get rich with crypto, filling our pockets with crypto profits. Although in this video, we're not talking about crypto, we're talking about politics, economics, macroeconomics, and we're going to be talking to Simon Ateba, who's the White House correspondent for Africa Now Today, or is it Africa Today Now? Anyway, I'll have the link in the description below. And we're going to be talking about what's happening in Africa as we have a shift in power from the United States to China and Russia. How is Africa being impacted? And of course, there's the conflict in Sudan and just some incredible stuff going on that I'm going to find out about. And in a moment, Simon, I'm going to apologize to you about something or acknowledge something, right? We'll come to that. But before I do that, please subscribe, follow me on Twitter, CryptoRichYT, join my official Telegram announcements channel, and please subscribe to me on Odyssey, bit.ly/CryptoRichOdyssey. Okay, Simon, thank you so much. Do you want to very briefly just introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you for having me. I work for Today News Africa and I cover the White House. And, Today News Africa focuses on, ties and interaction between the US and Africa. It's our belief that it's in the interest of Africa and in the interest of the US to have stronger ties between the US and the continent of Africa.
Okay, very good, very good. Thank you. And I've been wanting to get someone who's got an insight into what's happening in that continent on my channel for a while. I'm really grateful that you've made yourself available. Really appreciate it. And the thing that I want to acknowledge, and I think two things, actually all boiled down to one, is how poorly Africa is represented in the Western media. I'm in the UK, and I'm not in any way an expert on it, but I can get it's poorly represented. One way that it's poorly represented is how it's represented on the maps. Like it looks smaller than Russia, and it's much bigger, right? The other way that I think it's poorly represented is that I have this idea, and I think it's commonplace in the West because of how it's been represented historically, that it's one monolith, that Africa is the same all over, which I know, or I believe it can't be, from Morocco to South Africa and everything in between. It's a really big place with hundreds and hundreds of languages and different traditions and cultures and different religions and histories and stuff. So I just want to acknowledge that up front, that I come with that sort of level of poor understanding.
Yes. So, you're exactly right. There's something I heard or I read in a book, first impression. If you go on a date with a lady and you don't make a good first impression, she may not come back, even if you're the best person on earth. People find it really hard to change their opinion once they've had the first impression. And the first impression for people in the US, people in the West about Africa is that of slavery, underdevelopment, poverty, sickness, wars, and things like that. And that's what you used to have on television in the US, in many Western nations. And so it's hard for people to change their impression. It's only people who travel back to Africa, who, have friends from Africa, who know people in Africa who are doctors and lawyers and every single thing that you have in the US, in the UK, and everywhere else, who eventually end up changing their opinion about Africa. But even then, it's still really hard. But Africa is a continent, 54 or 55 countries, depending on who you ask. The AU usually talks about 55 African countries. The US, the UN here in New York City, close to where I am in Washington, D.C., always talks about 54 countries because they don't really recognize Western Sahara. And so you have those divisions. But, it's a big continent, 1.4 billion people who look different, colors and languages. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of languages in Africa. Nigeria, for instance, the most populous country in Africa, it's so diverse that when I used to travel across Nigeria, I was born in Cameroon, but I went to Nigeria to study and, really be in the most populous Black African nation and enjoy the culture. And while I was there, traveling as a journalist and went to all the 36 states, I began to realize how beautiful and diverse in culture, in languages, Nigeria is. When people talk about Nigeria outside Nigeria, they believe that even in Nigeria, people in Nigeria understand themselves. But you travel from one part of Nigeria to another part of Nigeria, and people speak different languages and have different culture. So I think it has to do with the first impression, the way Africa was represented, an historical fact, and it takes time for people to change their first impression.
Yes, and I think then it's useful for people to acknowledge that, okay, this is my first impression, right? Let me put that to one side. So they can put it to one side. And then I think the other stuff that I do know about Africa, because I've covered a couple of crypto projects that are launching in Africa or sourced out of Africa, is that it has a very young population. It's very resource rich. They're very mobile savvy. Nigeria has one of the highest rates of crypto adoption of any country in the world. And we're not going to be talking about crypto, but in that regard, it's going to have increasing role to play at a macro level, become increasingly important, especially as alliances are shifting from the US to China and Russia. And one of the things I've been noticing, and I've commented this on my on a couple of videos, is how there are, I think, 34, maybe I may have got the number exactly, 33, 34 nations that have been colonized, third world nations that have been colonized in as much as they don't have their own currencies.
Yes.
20 of them are in the European Union, and they've been colonized.
Yeah, and many of them, like in Africa, half of the countries in Africa that speak French still use the CFA franc.
Yeah.
And, they pay billions of dollars to France, central bank, to, basically make the money, produce the money for the currency for them. Even poor country like Burkina Faso have to pay so much money to France. Yet when a war explodes in Burkina Faso because of poverty, and France turns around and blames the Russian and blames the Wagner Group, because, they are the source of instability in West Africa. But they don't see how they have wreaked havoc in Africa and push already impoverished countries into even more poverty because they don't even allow them to have their own currencies. And as a result, they have to pay France so much money to essentially be the guardian of, the African currency. So you go to Cameroon, they use the CFA franc. And you go to Benin Republic, for instance, also in West Africa, they also use the CFA franc, but a different CFA franc, and it's a real mess. So it's a pity. I know we are not going to be talking about cryptocurrencies, but that's one of the reasons I was really upset. In the White House a few weeks last December. You remember last December, President Biden hosted the second U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit in Washington, D.C. And for those who don't really know much about Africa, Africa has as I said earlier, between 54 and 55 countries, depending on who you ask. And 50 of those African leaders came to Washington, D.C. for the second U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit in December. The first time that summit took place was in 2014 when President Obama was still in power. So that means that almost all the African leaders came to Washington, D.C. Yet the African guy who covered the White House for U.S.-Africa relations wasn't called on by the press secretary to ask questions. And I got upset because a few days before then, the French president came to the White House. One president came to the White House, and they gave him this big reception with red carpet everywhere. And the French journalists who were in the room were allowed to ask multiple questions. So it shows you the level of disrespect and the level of the colonial mentality that doesn't change. And it takes time for, as I said, the first impression. It happened in human relations. As I said, you go out with someone, you don't create the first good impression, they won't call back. Even if you're the best guy, even if you're the best lady on earth, because that first impression sticks and people find it hard to really change it. And what can change them is personal interaction with people from Africa, or, the brutal contact with reality. And sometimes, reality, people get to know things through movies and, radio and podcasts. They don't really travel and they don't have interactions with people.
Yes, and just on that question, you were on Tucker Carlson's show a week or so ago, and we're recording this on Saturday, the 29th of April, and it'll go out a few days later. And Tucker has he's no longer broadcasting on Fox News, everybody knows, right? But you were on, and you were talking about the poor treatment by, I forget her name, she's just an awful
the press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre.
Karine Jean-Pierre is an awful press secretary. I saw that interaction. And also, listen to you, I'm reminded of an interaction, I think, with the German ambassador and the Namibian president. I saw a little clip where the Namibian president was saying to the German ambassador, we treat you with respect when you come to our country, and your people are treated with respect when they come to our country, but that's not how you treat our people when they come to your country, which I think harks back to colonial imperial attitudes. And I'm from Pakistan, which is also a former British colony, so I have sympathy for how that worked out, and that whole discourse of colonialism, how it pervades relationships now, and where we have, I think, the European Union exporting its 21st century civilizing mission, which, back in the days of empire, it was Christianity, and now it's climate change. No development for you, right? No development for you. We will steal your resources, but no development for you. But I want to go to what you originally wanted to talk about, and what you said, which I think is really important, is the collapse of US diplomacy. And we must give your book a plug as well during the course of this conversation. All right. So the collapse of US diplomacy, I know that some of the former French colonies are giving the French government the heave-ho. I can't remember which one, whether it was Burkina Faso or Senegal, saying they're not going to use the CFA. I don't even know if Senegal used the CFA, but Sierra Leone or Burkina Faso, you'll correct me. One of them saying we're not going to use the CFA anymore. Macron going to the former French colonies to make nice with them. So please take it away.
Okay, so we see it as you know, I spent time at the White House. I attend all those briefings, background calls, and interact with people, talk to people, do serious journalism, and you begin to see what appears to be the collapse of U.S. diplomacy, especially under Antony Blinken, who is the Secretary of State.
Yeah,
we see it in Ukraine, right? When you ask people in the White House, "What's your game plan? How do we end this war?" And you quickly realize that he doesn't have any game plan. His family immigrated to the US from Ukraine. And so now he's the Secretary of State, and Ukraine is being attacked by Russia. And so I'm not accusing him of anything, but it appears that, the decisions that are being taken are not rational, but emotional and historical. And so even though, Ukraine cannot win this war, Russia cannot win the war either. No one wins those wars. There's no glory in the grave. There's no life in the graveyard. When people die, people die. And if you spend 10 years fighting this war, hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions of people will die. The military-industrial complex will make a lot of money. Ukraine will not win. Russia will not win. They will keep fighting for a long time, and it may even push us to the brink of World War III. And And so the question is, how do we end it? Because eventually we end the war through negotiations. A few weeks ago, when China proposed to mediate between Ukraine and Russia for a ceasefire, John Kirby, one of the spokesperson for the White House National Security Council, said now isn't the time for a ceasefire. And so the question was the best time for a ceasefire? But as you know, the war has continued and many people continue to die. And then that takes me to Sudan. In Sudan, recently on April 15th, we've had a war between the Sudanese armed forces and the rebel group, the Rapid Support Forces. And we've seen how many people have died. But what is really important is that the US called for a ceasefire many times and no one actually obeyed them, to the extent that the US, President Biden had to authorize an evacuation of the US embassy in Khartoum. And after evacuating the personnel at the US embassy, they realized that there were still thousands and thousands of Americans who were still trapped in Sudan. There are 16,000 Americans who are registered in Sudan. The US State Department says that most of those people are dual citizens and many of them don't really want to come back to the US. But when there's a war, if the country collapses, the duty of every government is to make sure you can safely evacuate your citizens. So we see it in Sudan where the US doesn't seem to have any leverage anymore. We see it in Ethiopia. We saw it in Ethiopia for almost 2 years between 2020 and 2023, 2022. We had, according to the US, we had 600,000 people who died during a war between the Ethiopian federal government and the TPLF, the Tigray forces, armed forces. And if you recall, the US was sending all kinds of people, Blinken and all kinds of envoys. But even with that, the war continued for more than 2 years, and 600,000 people were killed, millions of people were displaced, and that was the biggest humanitarian crisis in the war between 2020 and 2023, not the war in Ukraine. The international community tried to portray the war in Ukraine as the biggest disaster, but the biggest disaster was actually happening in Ethiopia. And we also see it in Somalia. A few weeks before October 29, the US intelligence agencies sent an alert to the US embassies in South Africa and Nigeria, and they told them there will be a bomb attack, a likely bomb attack, either in South Africa or Nigeria. South Africa is in Southern Africa, and Nigeria is in West Africa. On that same day, there was a bomb attack, not in Nigeria, not in South Africa, but in the north, in Somalia, that killed 100 people, 300 people, and wounded more than 300 others. No one took responsibilities. So you see the collapse of US diplomacy, the collapse of the intelligence agencies that don't actually get things wrong. And because they're not accountable to anyone, they make mistakes on even the classified documents. You've seen it that were leaked recently. They were online for months. And, even with a budget of $800 billion, the Defense Department and all the intelligence agencies, what you realize is, there's no return on investment. A good return on investment, and we see it in Africa. We've seen coups under Biden. We've seen people who have been trained by the U.S. Armed forces who return to Africa, example in Guinea, to stage coups. Recently, the head of the U.S. Africa Command in Africa, which is not located in Africa. The U.S. Africa Command is actually located in Stuttgart, Germany, and they are in charge of Africa. And so he came to Congress to testify, and he was confronted by Matt Gaetz, who is a Congress member from Florida. And Gaetz was able to show him names of people who had been trained by the U.S. Armed Forces who returned to Africa to overthrow governments. And so he was asked, do we share core values with these people? And he said, yes, we share core values with them. So you see where China is expanding, Russia is expanding, the US is shrinking. And that's why we started Today News Africa, because it's our belief that it's in the interest of Africa to have stronger relationship, strongest rapport, ties with the US in terms of democracy, in terms of transparency, in terms of things like that. And what we are realizing is, we are not really having it. We are having China buying everywhere, expanding bases, building roads and bridges, and really doing things that benefit the people, even though there's a lack of transparency in many of those projects. And you see the US trying to respond, and the US and the G20 and trying to respond and coming up with $600 billion that they would like to invest, but you realize in the next 5 or 6 years, but you realize the money is not actually going to Africa yet. And so all that shows you how the world is changing. China rising, Russia expanding, the US shrinking. And when someone like us start a publication, Today News Africa, that focuses on strengthening ties and interaction between US and Africa through accurate and relevant information, going against misinformation against the US, against those relations, instead of being applauded, instead of being encouraged and being, given the freedom to do our job. We are not asking you to give us money or give us anything, because then we won't be able to do a good job. But we are asking you to give us the freedom to do our job, give us the freedom to ask the questions that we need to ask. And you realize that has been challenging.
Yes. Well, just on freedoms are diminishing and being reduced in the United States and in the UK and in the European Union in the form of censorship, freedom to move, with the low traffic networks and the 15-minute cities being rolled out, all sorts of freedoms being diminished, freedoms for small businesses to flourish and grow and carry on what they're doing, right? Now, there's so much in what you said. We are talking about a large continent. We've only talked about a handful of countries. But the collapse of diplomacy in the US is a function of having a completely awful administration that is run by half-wits, fools, and nincompoops. I think what the United States strategy for the Ukraine war, is to keep the conflict going. The phrase is, in common parlance, to the last Ukrainian. That's his strategy. Let me kill all my country folk and sacrifice them in this war of attrition that Russia is waging. And there is no diplomacy. I mean, the people, just on the Ukraine-Russia war, the people that are advocating in the West for a peaceful negotiation, peaceful settlement, are the ones that are being smeared by the mainstream media. Viktor Orban of Hungary, Jeremy Corbyn, former opposition leader in Britain, Donald Trump, Tucker Carlson, all of them very obvious fascist, racist, white supremacists, right? It's just appalling, absolutely appalling. And I think in the background, and you don't have to agree with me or anything, in the background, this is what happens when currencies collapse and empires die. And I know when I went to Pakistan last year, I was looking at how the Ukraine-Russia conflict is regarded by the Pakistani media. Very different. And I imagine, there's a way that the rest of the world, that Africa views the conflict and views the fall of the United States, which has had this very toxic relationship with the global South, to where we have diplomacy by Lavrov and Xi Jinping. So anything you want to say about how the shift is manifesting in Africa?
Yeah, so I can just give you 2 examples. So it's good to have something concrete. This week, the South African president, I'm sure maybe you saw it in the news, announced that his country was ready to leave the International Criminal Court. Yes. Because Putin will go to South Africa for the BRICS meetings. And then he became, I don't know if he received some calls, and then he came back the next day to say that there was an error in communication and they are not actually leaving, but they're not going to arrest Putin or any of those things. In 2021, there was a vote at the UN after the war in Ukraine started. and they wanted all the nations to come together and condemn Russia and condemn the war and, have the resolution. And so what the US realized was a lot of African countries decided to either abstain, not sign it, or even support Ukraine. And South Africa was one of the countries that tended to be more, more
non-aligned.
That spoke more openly about, for Russia actually said that the US actually provoked the war. The president of South Africa said it. You can go back and then look for it.
Good for him.
And so what was the US response? The US realized we are losing influence around the world and we are losing influence in Africa. So we need to do something. So in August of 2021, Anthony Blinken went to August of 2022, a year after, in 2023 August, Anthony Blinken went to South Africa to announce or unveil the new US Africa policy, which was actually the same policy he has, 4 legs and we focus on this and that. But it was the same thing. And so they decided to also have the US Africa Summit in December, where you can bring all those guys to Washington, D.C. and try to, have relationship with them. But when they came to D.C., President Biden didn't even have time to sit down with them. He didn't schedule any one-on-one meeting with any of the African leaders. He ended up seeing the president of Nigeria, but he wasn't on schedule, right? They didn't have any one-on-one. So Blinken was the one seeing president. And among the African communities, they saw it as an insult, for them to travel all the way from Africa to the US and only to come to Washington, D.C. They can't even sit 5 minutes with President Biden to discuss US relation with their own countries. And so it shows you that vote losing, not having the African vote at the UN in 2021, and seeing what's going on in Africa, where the US will say we need this war to end, the war will continue, or the US will be seen to be backing the Tigray people, and the Chinese will decide to back the government, and the government will still be in power. And so we see China rising, we see Russia expanding in influence, we see South Africa saying that they're actually leaving the International Criminal Court because it's biased towards African. And we see people in South Africa saying that the Russian president is welcome here, he can come to our country. And so that shows you where the US is right now. The level of the recent conflict and the recent collapse of the US diplomacy in Ukraine, in Sudan, in Ethiopia, in Guinea, in other places where you had coups in the past few months and years, shows you that the US has to do something. Final thing that we see on the collapse of the US, the head of the US Africa Command, while he was testifying in Senate, after testifying in the House of Representatives, he went to Senate, and he was asked, what is the US greatest threat in Africa right now? And he said, our greatest threat in Africa right now is China. And he gave 3 reasons. Some of the reasons that he gave were the fact that China is installing military bases across Africa that threaten US national security. But one of the key reasons that he gave was the mineral resources, because 40% of the mineral resources being used by American companies come from Africa, with China having military bases in strategic locations where those mineral bases are either being exploited or on the brink of being exploited. They may push out the US. So you have a continent where you have business ties and where your economy is dependent on mineral resources from this continent. But, you are being displaced. You're not, allowing people like myself and other people who are trying to strengthen that relation. And I'm not against the Chinese. I'm not against the Russian as people, the people from Pakistan and any other country. I love all people. But our publication focuses on strengthening ties between US and Africa. And so if you can at least give us the freedom to do our job, if you can give a one-on-one time to African leaders who come to DC to meet with you, if you can talk to the people fighting in Sudan, the two generals there, and ask them, hey, let's have negotiation. If you can't you are unable to bring peace to those countries, it shows you where the US is now, and it's the total collapse to US diplomacy under Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State.
Yes, well, under Joe Biden, with perhaps Barack Obama in the background pulling the strings, and the WEF playing their part, right? But I told you before we started recording that today I recorded a video with Tom Luongo, Alexander Mercurius of the Duran.com, and Alex Trainer. And one of the things, I think Alexander Mercurius made this point, that China and Russia, the relationships that they're developing with the global south is trade-based, which is a sharp contrast to the extractive imperial relationships that the United States and Europe have had with the global south, where they use military means, diplomatic means, and financial means in order to extract wealth from the global south.
Okay, I will say that China is not different. On the surface, they are just trying to replicate exactly what the West did in Africa. They are not saying. First of all, they are providing a lot of loans to African nations. A lot of those loans, not transparent.
Right.
The IMF, the World Bank, they're also providing a lot of loans, including the African Development Bank. And those loans are also questionable. But at least you can open the book, you can know how much money had come, what is the interest rate, when will you repay it, when is the first batch, reaching the country in question, what will the money be used for? Now, sometimes the money is not used for the purpose, right? Like we say we need to. Yesterday I was on a call with the IMF mission chief in Central African Republic. They are giving them $194.1 million, and the bulk of that money will be used to pay salaries. And I remember asking the IMF's chief, so after you pay the salaries, how does this help these people for development? How do they even repay? I mean, do we need more money tomorrow to pay salaries? How does that help them to, build roads and bridges and, develop the infrastructure? And so what we realized is, the Chinese, they are building bridges and they are building roads, they are developing the infrastructure, but also they are providing the kind of loan that eventually people can't repay, and we take over those parts and take over those airports so it's they are actually trying to do the exact same thing that Africa did, that the West did, and also the G20. They are trying to respond. If you remember I think in 2022 or 2021, when they were in Germany, I think the G7, I can't remember exactly, but I know we did a story on that, where they pledged $600 billion in infrastructure development in Africa in the next 5 years. So they are trying to take action, but it's so slow. Right now, I can't even tell you how much money has actually reached, companies trying to do business with Africa. So yes, China is into more of trade, infrastructure development. The US is also trying to do some, but it's a mess that the US can't do more. As I said, we focus on US-Africa relations. So I will be a bit biased when it comes to Africa and be a bit biased when it comes to US-Africa relations, because that's our focus. Sure. And that doesn't mean, I'm against China or any other country.
What about China and Russia? They've said to certain African nations, forgive me, I can't remember which ones, that you can default on your debts. We will support you, nationalize your industries.
And if you remember, you can Google this. Russia recently had some debt forgiveness for Africa.
Mm.
And so people have been pushing the IMF that, Russia is forgiving the debt. What are you doing, right? You guys are supposed to be friends of Africa, but you're not. We paid so much. We paid the entire debt. Now we are paying the interest, and the interest is more than the money you gave us. And so you keep us in poverty. And now we come to Washington, D.C. for another annual meetings and spring meeting. Why don't you cancel the debt, so you can give us the breathing room that we need to invest in infrastructure, to, invest in education and healthcare and all this stuff. And you realize even, it's hard. And I forgot to tell you something, when I was talking about how Africans perceive the US. This month, there was the IMF spring meetings here in Washington, D.C. At the end of the meetings, there was a conference on African by African finance ministers. And one journalist asked them where they stand between US and China and, Africa and Russia. And so one of the finance ministers who answered the questions said, we want to do business with everybody. We want to do business with the US, with China, with Russia, with everybody. And so it shows you how, even in Washington, D.C., Africans have been clear. They want to be open for business. They want to do business with everybody.
Whoever's going to give them the best deal.
Yeah, and they also realize that China is giving them, the best deal and doesn't interfere in human rights and, democracy and all those things. And so the Iraqis, some of them are dictators. So they've been there for a long time. And so they don't want someone reminding them that they need to go. For instance, in Cameroon, the president has been there for almost 4 decades. And he's doing a lot of businesses with China. And when the US reminds him of human rights, that wouldn't go very well. The Chinese will say, let's just do business and we don't really care about your politics, which is not also great for Africa. So we need to balance it. What type of partners do we want? Do we want China? Do we want US? Or do we want all of them and some of them? Or take a little bit of something from each of them and also give out something for a, decent relationship?
Do you know, Simon, one of the filters that I use often looking at macroeconomics, one is playground politics, the other is gangsters. They're gangsters, gangsters with different flavors, right? Different strategies, all vying for resources. And then, unfortunately, us, the little people, we end up being hit in the collateral. So, you got American gangsters dealing with Chinese gangsters, or vying for control from Chinese gangsters and Russian gangsters and EU gangsters. They're all gangsters, right? And then I suppose at a national level, whether it's Pakistan or Cameroon or wherever, right? There's those small petty gangsters.
Yeah, exploitation and business.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I appreciate we've gone over, right? We've gone over anything you want to say to finish up, and I really just appreciate.
Okay, so thank
you. Don't forget your book that you're.
Yeah, so I'm completing my book right now. That's why I took a 2-week break from the White House briefing room. I'm talking about me. It's about my time in the White House and my journey from Cameroon to the White House to Nigeria, and making news in Nigeria even though I wasn't born there, and making news in the US even though I wasn't born here. And I think it's the belief that anywhere you are, you have to contribute to the society, because you don't know which day is the last day. And you may say, hey, I was born in Africa and I don't have anything to do in the US, but you're in the US, things here are affecting you. Mental illnesses are affecting you and things around you are affecting you. So you need to contribute. So I'm talking about that in my book, but I just want everyone watching us now to keep praying for me to, keep doing my job, praying for me to be able to do my job, even in the White House, to defend the First Amendment, and understand that even in the White House, things are not perfect. The reason the US is still the most advanced country in the world is because of those freedoms. And if you lose those freedoms, and then, the US will soon collapse. I won't call it the empire, Someone said the US is almost an empire with armies everywhere, but the US, as we know it today, will not be the same. So keep praying for me, and also go to my Twitter handle at Simon Ateba, SIMONATEBA, and follow me. And I just a few months ago, 4 months ago, I had 2,000 followers. And so in 4 months, I am now approaching 350,000 followers, and I have one of the most engaged Twitter handles. Sometimes when I publish, I tweet, I have 100,000 people who like my tweets. And that's because I'm able to understand my audience and provide to people the truth and the facts that they need. And respect them, and also understand that you need to drive conversation online. Don't dump things on people. Have a conversation with them, and I'm glad to have you there and keep this conversation going.
Yes, well, Simon, listen, I would love to have you back on again, because this is just our introductory conversation and stuff. I think there's more to dig in, and I think it's important for people to know what is really going on in Africa and in the entire world. I appreciate you with your 300,000 plus Twitter followers, and me with my 7,500 that you replied to my DM and agreed to come on, right? So thank you. It's very, very generous. And do let us know when the book is available for people. And just really, really appreciate the work that you do in bringing awareness of what is going on in the second largest continent in the world to the rest of us. Really, really appreciate it. And anybody who's watching, if you have any comments or questions, put them in the description below. And between now and when I see you next, please keep filling your pockets with freedom and with information. This is Crypto Rich. Simon, I need to find another way to finish this, because this hasn't been about crypto. But anyway, this is Crypto Rich and Crypto Simon signing out. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you.